Love is a beautiful feeling about which books, music, and poems are written. However, when it is the twisted love of a sick person, it can be so destructive that it breaks many fates. Amy Carnevale was born on April 13, 1977, in Beverly, Massachusetts, USA. Her father was a science teacher at a local school, and her mother worked as an investment advisor. Amy had a brother named Christopher who was born 4 years earlier. The Carnevale family proved to be typical representatives of the middle class who were able to realize their dreams. The family was united, all members were close to each other and did not abandon one another in difficult moments. But a few years after the girl's birth, the family began to break apart. Gradually, the mother and father concluded that they needed to get a divorce. At that time, Amy was 6 years old, and it was a big shock for her. She worried for a long time, but eventually came to terms with it. When she went to school, a new chapter in her life began, full of hope. The family did not lose contact with the child, so the echo of the separation of mom and dad quickly faded. Amy grew into a beautiful and intelligent girl and became popular at school. She joined the cheerleading team and played field hockey. Amy was very friendly and got along well with everyone. Despite her active social life, she was very connected to nature and preferred walks in the fresh air. Amy loved to combine nature with sports, often going golfing with her father, even though she lived with her mother. She had a good relationship with her father. She wanted to become a hairdresser in the future, as she enjoyed making her friends look beautiful. At the time of the events in question, she was about to transition to high school. As a cheerleader, she was immediately offered a spot on the team, which made her very happy. It didn't take long for her to meet a young man named Jamie Fuller. They met accidentally at a friend's party when Amy was 12 years old, and Jamie was already 14. By the time of the tragic end of this story, they had been together for a little more than 2 years. Everyone knew that Jamie was a difficult guy and often caused trouble. In elementary school, he was neither aggressive nor mean, but some of his jokes went too far. Amy's parents disapproved of the relationship, believing Jamie was not worthy of her. When he met the girl, he was a thin guy and later decided to start exercising. His main goal was to build muscles to become a tough guy. To accelerate this process, Jamie began taking steroids, and after a year of hard training, he became significantly more robust. The young couple had often had problems in their relationship, sometimes not speaking for weeks and then resuming their relationship. After Jamie started taking steroids, Amy and her friends noticed a dramatic change in his behavior. Jamie became increasingly aggressive and unpredictable. They began to argue constantly, both at school and outside of it. Jamie's behavior towards Amy worsened. Later, some friends reported that Jamie repeatedly physically attacked and threatened Amy, accompanied by vile insults she did not deserve. As she grew older, the situation worsened. She didn't know what to look for in a relationship or how to deal with such behavior from her boyfriend. His behavior was a display of power. Jamie tried to control her, and things got out of control. He started dictating who Amy could talk to and who she couldn't, found out where and when she was going, and tried to separate her from her closest friends and even her family. Jamie controlled her more and more, telling her what to wear, how to look, and who to meet. He tried to exclude her entire circle of friends from the school sports team, imposing himself on her and convincing her that Amy only needed him. Although she obeyed, he always found new reasons for insults and conflicts. Her friends repeatedly witnessed the humiliation she suffered from Jamie. Since 2020, some states have enacted a law that punishes attempts to manipulate and control a person. It has been proven that the lives of the victims begin to take a dramatic turn before they face real danger, such as physical abuse or even death. Unfortunately, at that time, there was nothing Jamie could be accused of, even though her friends were very worried about what was happening. Jamie's behavior became increasingly unpredictable, leading to legal problems. In the 90s, he was twice arrested for armed assault on a man, but due to his age and lack of a criminal record, Jamie got off scot-free. He persuaded his girlfriend to stay silent about these incidents, and she indeed told very few people about them. During this time, they broke up repeatedly and got back together. The relationship was clearly in a downward spiral. Jamie went out with other girls, Amy declared the breakup, but then they got back together. In this case, the girl almost did not share her problems with friends and family. In fact, she was raised by a mother who worked a lot and therefore had no opportunity to delve deeply into her daughter's private life problems. Amy herself remained reserved on this matter. At the same time, they were dealing with real estate issues, having been forced to rent a house for a long time. During this time, the girl stayed with various friends, briefly moving in with a girl named Diane Weger, her 15-year-old classmate. It turned out she was one of Jamie's ex-girlfriends. Nevertheless, the students got along well and became close friends. The situation was supposed to stabilize on September 5, 1991, when Amy was to move into her new house with her mother and brother. They had lived in a rented apartment for a long time, which had strained the family budget. The move was a long-awaited event that was to fundamentally change the family's life. On August 23, 1991, Amy was still staying with her friend Diane. Shortly before, she had broken up again with her manipulative boyfriend and did not intend to get back with him. That day, Amy went to another field hockey practice and excitedly told her friends that she had finally decided to end the toxic relationship. However, she also reported that Jamie kept calling her. Amy tried to ignore him, but he was too persistent. After reaching her, Jamie tried to arrange a meeting, but the girl refused. Then he asked her to give him a haircut as a farewell gesture to remember their past love. Finally, the girl agreed. That evening, she went to Jamie's house, intending to return in a few hours. But she did not return to her friend's house at the appointed time. The concern grew. This was a 14-year-old teenager, and the long delay worried the friend she was staying with. The girl called Amy's mother, but she could not find her daughter either. Suspicion grew because Amy had left her handbag and other belongings behind, indicating she would not be gone long. After waiting through the night, it was decided to notify the police the next morning. Fortunately, the police officers did not use the classic excuse that the disappearance had not been long enough to take action. After visiting the police station, the mother of the missing girl decided to visit her ex-boyfriend, where Amy was supposed to go. She told the investigators about the history of this toxic relationship, which immediately raised suspicion. Jamie was initially cooperative, speaking with the woman and the police, answering all questions willingly, and even joining a search party that began combing the area. Although he was the main suspect in the disappearance, no trace of the girl could be found. The young man's house and car were searched but to no avail. On August 28, 1991, the police station received a call from an informant who did not want to reveal his name. He claimed to know where Amy's body was and named the location. The police officers responded to this information with great interest. Naturally, the investigators wanted to know who this confidential informant was and how he had this information. They managed to track him down, finding a 19-year-old named Michael Marlette. The young man turned out to be Jamie's friend. When the police showed up at his door, he immediately decided to cooperate with the investigation. At the police station, he confessed everything he knew about the fateful night of August 23. According to him, Amy had planned to go to the beach with her friends the evening before the tragedy, on August 22. Jamie found out about this plan and was furious when he realized that his ex-girlfriend had actually gone to the beach party, where there were other boys. He became extremely jealous and lost control. Jamie paced the room like a wild animal. He still wanted to keep Amy under his control. Michael met with him that day, and Jamie revealed his plan to kill his ex. It turned out that several people knew about the manipulator's plans from the beginning, but for some reason, they did not go to the police. They did not tell anyone about the threat, not even Amy herself. Even the girl's parents were not informed of the potential danger. On the evening of August 23, Amy arrived at her ex-boyfriend's house, thinking she was going to cut his hair. It turned out that 4 boys were present: Jamie himself, 15-year-old Dominic Scholar, 19-year-old Michael Mallet, and 17-year-old Scott Ward. Just before the girl arrived, Jamie took out a large knife, showed it to his friends, and said he would massacre Amy. He placed it on the cabinet, wrapped it in a towel, and stashed it in his black backpack. When the girl arrived, Jamie suggested that the whole group take a walk in the nearby woods. During the walk, he went far ahead with Amy, and the other 3, according to Michael, lost sight of them. Michael also admitted that he didn't fully believe in his friend's intentions. He thought Jamie only wanted to intimidate Amy because of the breakup and jealousy. A few minutes later, the friends heard terrifying screams, but none of the boys dared to go and find out what was happening. They were all scared. Only Michael ran to the scene. There he saw a bloody girl on the ground, having been stabbed several times. The major wounds were on her chest, back, and abdomen. She tried to get up and run away, but the young man caught her, grabbed her by the hair, and slit her throat. Michael said he simply had no time to save the victim, having heard the screams too late. After Amy fell to the ground with her throat cut, she was still fighting for her life. Michael claimed she only managed to say, "Jamie, I love you." However, this made the perpetrator angry, and he began stomping on her head. Covered in blood, Jamie then returned to his friends and started recounting what had happened, brandishing the bloody knife. According to Michael, everyone was scared to interfere, fearing the same fate, and thus supported Jamie. Altogether, they returned home, drank, and talked for several hours in peace. Jamie showered, washed off the blood, and changed his bloody clothes. Then the killer and Michael went back to the woods to the spot where he had left the body. By then, it was already dark. They wrapped the girl's body in garbage bags, joking and laughing about what had happened, showing no remorse or regret. The police informant repeatedly emphasized that this was due to fear of the murderer. After wrapping Amy in garbage bags and tape, the young men carried the body to the car. Along the way, they continued mocking the victim. When they reached the pond, they tied several concrete blocks to the body and threw it into the water from the dock. The ex-boyfriend drowned the body of the dead schoolgirl after making another snide remark about her. Then he took out the bracelet and bloody necklace of his victim, wiped the blood off, and put them around her neck. This behavior resembled that of a serial killer, as such criminals often keep trophies to remember their crimes. After Michael told the investigators the whole story, he was asked again how he could have been involved in the death of the young girl. The young man explained that he did not stab her but only helped a friend dispose of her body under duress. He admitted he was scared of Jamie and wanted to keep the whole thing a secret from the start. Michael was sure his friend would kill him if he found out about the conversation with the police. He confessed that all the friends initially thought the idea of the murder was a bad joke and realized the gravity of the situation only when it was too late. According to Michael's testimony, the 3 friends just played along with the perpetrator to avoid provoking his aggression, but eventually, he couldn't bear it anymore and decided to tell the truth. On August 28, the informant was taken to the pond he had mentioned. Michael showed them the spot where the body was disposed of. Around 7:30 a.m., divers found Amy's body. It was in a deplorable condition, clearly having been brutally killed. The coroner found her in the same clothes she wore on the day of her disappearance, An analysis of the clothing revealed she had died on Friday, the day she disappeared. The experts could also confirm everything Michael said about her injuries. About 10 stab wounds were found on the victim's body. Her throat was deeply slit, and her skull was crushed by multiple blows. Jamie had probably stomped on her head. The police could not find Jamie, he was missing. The mother of the suspect claimed she did not know where he was. The police decided to contact the other young men Michael had mentioned. It turned out they had known about the plans for the murder for over a year. During all the time the young people broke up and got back together, Jamie had told them he could no longer be with Amy, but he was irresistibly drawn to her and didn't want to let her go. Unable to bear the thought of her being with someone else, he decided to kill her. The longer the police spoke to the two young men, the more gruesome details of the crime emerged. It turned out that shortly before the last breakup, Amy had told her boyfriend she was pregnant by him. He was very unhappy about this, especially since the girl wanted to keep the baby. Jamie was furious and even offered his friends money to attack Amy and punch her in the stomach, hoping she would lose the baby as he didn't want to be burdened with such a responsibility. But his friends refused. One of the perpetrator's friends described how Jamie screamed that Amy never agreed to an abortion, which ultimately led Jamie to decide to massacre her. After waiting for the autopsy results, the investigators found that the deceased was not pregnant at the time of her death. The pregnancy story became one of the many rumors and speculations surrounding the case. It was not proven that the victim was pregnant at all. It was possible she had terminated the pregnancy. Unfortunately, due to the condition of the body, it was impossible to confirm these assumptions. The investigators contacted Diane, who had been Amy's roommate before her disappearance. It turned out she was Jamie's ex-girlfriend and had experienced the same relationship problems as Amy. Diane could fully understand her friend's feelings, having gone through the toxic relationship herself. She had also been abused and pressured by her boyfriend but managed to end the malicious relationship without hurting herself. Surprisingly, Diane was also aware of her ex-boyfriend's intentions to murder Amy. Shortly before her friend moved in with her, Jamie had spoken of plans for a walk in the woods where he would first give Amy flowers, then stab her, and dump her body in a pond. But Diane did not believe the story and did not warn anyone about the danger. When the attacker was finally discovered, arrested, and charged with first-degree murder, he smiled. Jamie even made another joke about the deceased. He clearly felt no remorse or guilt. During the interrogation, he remained calm, even trying to blame his friends for Amy's massacre. However, questioning other acquaintances in the victim's immediate circle revealed that Michael had bragged about helping Jamie dispose of the body after the murder. He was also arrested for aiding in the crime. Apparently, the other two friends were also suspects, having witnessed the massacre but never reporting it to the police. They also knew about their friend's intentions, which he had been talking about for almost a year. At Amy's funeral, one of the witnesses to this tragedy, Scott Worth, attended. The young man even gave an interview to a local newspaper, stating that he still couldn't believe what had happened and felt guilty for not raising the alarm in time, even though he could have prevented the murder. At that time, an investigation was already underway against him. The teenagers revealed that Michael was not as innocent in the story as he claimed. He had incited Jamie, pushing him to kill the girl, and it was possible his role in the massacre was much more significant than he admitted. Finally, the police concluded that only Michael and Jamie were involved in the murder. The others had nothing to do with the crime and were not arrested. Public dissatisfaction grew. Everyone wanted to know the truth and protect the streets from scoundrels who kill schoolgirls without any particular reason. Residents believed, rightly, that all four teenagers were guilty of this tragedy. Their parents defended the youths, claiming they knew nothing of Jamie's plans, did not help him with the murder, and were therefore innocent. but the police already knew Jamie had repeatedly talked about his plans in the presence of the teenagers, who even urged him to act on his words. This behavior may have led the unstable Jamie to fear appearing weak. So what was the motive for killing Amy? Jealousy, a psychotic outburst, the desire to kill her child, or incitement? Although the young man was 16 at the time, he was tried as an adult. He pleaded not guilty and was released on bail of $10,000, paid by his mother. The defense argued that the young man had consumed alcohol, which, combined with steroids, could trigger an uncontrollable fit of aggression. Therefore, the defense wanted the case dismissed on grounds of insanity. The lawyers argued that the crime was not premeditated and that excessive use of steroids can cause psychoses and other mental disorders. They requested a psychiatric evaluation for Jamie. Several examinations were conducted, including by independent experts, and all found Jamie to be sane and competent. The prosecution, on the other hand, insisted that the motive for the attack was jealousy and the girl's alleged pregnancy. They pointed to his manipulative behavior, strict control, and constant attacks on the deceased in the last months of their relationship. According to Michael's testimony, Jamie wanted to get back at Amy for going to a beach party with her friends. Another friend in the company insisted that Jamie felt it necessary to end the girl's pregnancy by any means. The prosecution had numerous witnesses. One of Jamie's friends, Ronald, who had attended a carpentry class with him in the spring of 1991, also appeared in court. He testified that Jamie had told him about Amy's pregnancy and added that the only way to get rid of the baby was to kill the girl. Dominic, who was among the boys that evening, said he had seen Jamie and his girlfriend walking into the woods. Then he heard some screams. When Jamie returned to the others, he had a lot of blood on his clothes and hands. Jamie showed the others the bloody knife with which he had committed the massacre. The knife's tip was bent, indicating the extreme brutality of the attack. He had struck the weapon hard against the victim's bones, causing the knife to bend. Dominic confirmed Michael's words. Jamie told them the story of how he committed the massacre. According to the perpetrator, he first covered Amy's mouth and told her he loved her before stabbing her in the stomach. She was still alive when he slit her throat. Then the schoolgirl said she still loved him, which made Jamie so angry that he stomped on her throat and jumped on her head. Contrary to the defense's claim, the young men confirmed that the attack was committed soberly. They consumed alcohol only after the girl was killed. At the same time, the defendant's mother had previously told the police officers that alcohol had always had a harmful effect on him, causing rage and aggression. Once, he practically destroyed his room when he was drunk and arguing with his mother. But in this case, alcohol had nothing to do with it. The coroner, who testified for the prosecution in court, said he had found such deep stab wounds that they practically pierced the girl's body, indicating the immense hatred with which the murder was committed. No traces of sexual violence were found, meaning the attack was out of revenge or jealousy. One of the blows hit the bone, deforming the murder weapon. The girl also had multiple bruises on her face and head injuries. Any of the wounds could have been fatal, making it difficult to determine the exact cause of Amy's death given the condition of her body. Jamie did not testify in court but spoke to the media. He told reporters he couldn't have killed Amy because he still loved her. Of course, this was a lie from the perpetrator, who was apparently obsessed with his victim. This interview was another shock for the deceased girl's mother. She struggled to overcome the bitterness of her loss, taking tranquilizers and seeing a psychologist. Jamie's love declaration for Amy on television seemed to her as disgusting cynicism from the perpetrator. The trial lasted 7 days before the jury retired to deliberate. The prosecution insisted he was an extremely dangerous murderer with the potential to become a serial killer and therefore should spend the rest of his life in prison. The defense, however, insisted that the young man had lost control due to steroid abuse. The jury deliberated for 2 days, taking about 6 hours to reach a verdict. Jamie was found guilty on October 23, 1992, and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. While Jamie was being sentenced, the authorities still had to deal with his friend Michael, who had clearly helped him dispose of the evidence. After a hearing on his complicity, Michael was sentenced to 2 years in prison. The deceased girl's mother considered this an unjustly light sentence for aiding in Amy's murder. After the trial, Jamie was sent to a medium-security prison, where it was expected he would spend the rest of his days behind bars. But in the summer of 1993, his mother Celeste and her partner Edward devised a plan. The worried mother decided to get her son out of prison. Jamie was to seriously injure himself to be taken to a hospital outside the prison, from where he would be freed. They managed to hire 2 male inmates to attack and injure Jamie. However, the plan was initially doomed to fail because the prison had its own hospital. Nevertheless, the attackers did not consider these details and began preparing for the assault. Unbeknownst to them, the prison authorities were aware of their intentions. The phone calls in the prison were monitored, so the plan was known from the preparation and discussion phase. Consequently, Celeste and Edward were arrested, and their son was transferred to a high-security prison for the attempted crime. In fact, it was Jamie's cellmate who prevented the likely new crime. He informed the prison director when Jamie told him about his escape plan. His statement was supported by telephone calls. Celeste and Edward refused to plead guilty. The hearing took place on September 9, 1993. All 3, including Jamie, were charged with aiding and abetting a prison escape, organizing a prison escape, and conspiracy. The trials took place between September 1993 and 1994. All 3 were found guilty. Celeste was sentenced to 6 to 9 years in prison, her partner to 2 years, and Jamie's life sentence was extended by another 99 years. The young criminal soon tried to appeal the sentence, citing his minor age, but his appeal was denied. Unfortunately, there was a glimmer of hope in his story. In 2013, state law changed so that offenders convicted of serious crimes as juveniles were eligible for parole. Each case was to be reviewed individually. As a result of these changes, Jamie, who had spent most of his adult life in prison, could be released in 2019. By then, he was 40 years old. Jamie's parole application was considered but indefinitely postponed. The family of the murder victim repeatedly appealed to the authorities, insisting that this violent man should not be released under any circumstances. To this day, he remains in prison. Amy's mother never recovered from her daughter's death. She was forced to constantly see a psychiatrist and take a large number of prescription medications. In 2009, her health deteriorated dramatically, and she died at the age of 57. Those close to her were sure that her early death was related to the death of her little daughter. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves. Sometimes, love is mistaken for possessiveness, and temperament and charisma for bad character. It's unfortunate that such mistakes in some situations can be fatal, as was the case with the protagonists of today's story. On Monday, July 3, 2012, in the quiet small town of Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania, USA, cart mechanics were diligently working on their cars in their garages. Frank Spencer's friend, Joe, hadn't heard from his buddy since the beginning of the weekend. At this point, the team was in the middle of a series they aimed to win, with a good chance of victory. However, after the last races, problems with the cars arose. Joe needed advice, so he decided to visit Frank at home. He didn't answer his mobile phone, which was turned off. As Joe searched for his friend, he jokingly thought, "I hope I haven't found him dead," and he had a good reason for these grim thoughts. Joe drove to his friend's house and was immediately alarmed. The front door was ajar, and there were bloodstains on the doorstep. Joe's worst fears were confirmed. The best friend of the racer was found in the house, lying on the floor and showing no signs of life. This energetic, active man now appeared calmer than ever before. Joe stood in shock for a few seconds, frozen and unable to move. He silently stared at his friend, knowing he would never shake his hand again. Walking around the body, he saw dried blood oozing from a gunshot wound near the ear. He then called emergency services and reported the gruesome discovery. Joe was sure who was behind the crime. In 1977, Frank Spencer and his lover Maria were crazy about each other. Their parents disapproved of the relationship and tried for a long time to prevent it, but the couple did not give up. Eventually, the lovers decided to take action. They ran away from home and rented an apartment far from their families. After some time, their relationship was finally accepted. The families realized that further nagging would only make things worse, and they didn't want to lose contact with the young couple. Maria and Frank married and first had a son, then a daughter. Afterwards, the young family moved into a house where they began to create a cozy nest. Frank worked hard and tirelessly, always putting his family first. He built his career and expanded his business to provide everything his family needed. His father shared the same vision. Frank's father ran the business for many years, and after his retirement, his son took over. According to Frank's friends, Maria had a less warm attitude toward family and married life. Indeed, Maria showed little interest in the children, seemed to be her own person, and was not particularly concerned with domestic matters. Maria cared mostly about money and liked to spend it. Against this backdrop, an almost complete indifference of the mother toward her own children, the marriage gradually began to shake. In 2006, the couple decided to file for divorce, initiated by Frank. He was tired of the constant disagreements and arguments. His wife's outbursts became simply unbearable. She behaved so inappropriately that the man feared for the children's health. During this time, the relationship heated up to the maximum. After deciding to end the marriage, even more serious disputes began. Frank wanted to keep the children with him, as he was sure his wife would not take proper care of them. However, there were people in his circle who disagreed with this point of view. His friend Ron believed that contact with both parents was necessary for the children and that a custody agreement should be reached by dividing it between the two. Frank was not opposed to the mothers seeing the children, but he wanted to protect them from the carelessness and potential danger posed by Maria. One way or another, the woman wanted sole custody despite her ex-husband, as this would mean she could count on significant alimony payments. She did not want to work. On this basis, it led to serious conflicts between the former spouses. They continued regularly every time they talked about the divorce and the division of custody. Frank repeatedly called the police to the house because Maria behaved inappropriately towards him and the children. She threw herself at everyone. In 2008, Maria had to be arrested due to a dispute with Frank's mother that occurred directly at the school of their common child. Maria wanted to pick up the girl, and the former mother-in-law tried to prevent this because it was a spontaneous decision by the mother, and they already had another appointment for that day. After the argument was over, the mother drove the girl away in her car, but she forgot to buckle her up, which the patrol officers noticed who stopped the car. The woman's behavior was seen as a threat to the life and health of the child. Against this background, Maria came into conflict with the law, and a criminal case was initiated against her. In addition, Frank described her as a stalker and claimed that she was following him. A case was initiated, but the prosecutor believed there was not enough evidence and proof to demonstrate a threat to the life of the children. Maria was offered a deal. She pleaded guilty to bullying and harassment, but the charge of alleged endangerment of her daughter's life was dropped. She was ultimately fined $600 for her behavior, but even the penalty did not lead the negligent mother to reconsider her behavior. On the contrary, Maria became even more bitter, especially towards her ex-husband. From this point on, Frank's friends and family were increasingly confronted with his complaints. He said Maria had begun to threaten and harass him without embarrassing other people. After some time, there were many witnesses who heard these threats with their own ears. Frank continued to remain calm and tried to document all incidents so that he could go to the police. He wanted the matter to stop because Maria had clearly overreacted. In 2009, the divorce proceedings were still not concluded. At this point, 3 years had already passed, but the dispute was far from over. The children had lived with her, their mother, all the time. Despite the difficulties with his former wife, Frank wanted to move on. During this time, he met another woman named Julie Dent. The couple got to know each other through mutual friends and soon began a serious relationship, which the stalker quickly learned about. The situation escalated when the rumors reached Maria. According to her, she didn't care that Julie spent time with Frank, but the fact that a stranger was interacting with her children upset her very much. Frank considered this a lie since Julie had always been very nice to his children and had taken better care of them than their own mother. In his opinion, the real motive for Maria's aggression was jealousy. From that moment, a new round of deterioration in the relationships with her ex-husband began. This was also contributed to by a man named Anthony Rock Franklin, Maria's father, being released from prison. He had served his 5-year sentence for fraud. This was very bad news for Frank because Rock had a cool temperament, a bad reputation, and was a quite violent and aggressive man. Many believed that Maria's character was precisely in him. Frank's relatives noticed during this time that he was constantly worried. He began to develop paranoia, which turned out to be not unfounded. Just a few months after Rock's release, burglars broke into Spencer's office, which Frank led. Nothing valuable was stolen from the business owner, but documents were missing from his private office that could help Maria get alimony from her husband. She planned to open his business records, apparently to find some irregularities. The morning after the incident, Frank received a call from Maria. Her words sounded absurd. The woman said she had found a trash bag with his documents on her porch, where it had been lying since the morning. No one in Frank's office could be proven to have participated in the burglary. According to law enforcement, the perpetrator left no traces that could be traced back to him. However, friends and acquaintances of Frank were convinced that only 2 people could have committed the burglary, the victim's ex-wife and her father, Rock, who had recently been released from prison. The investigators examined the burglary site and approached Marie as the main suspect but could not prove her involvement. Finally, the investigations were stopped because no conclusive evidence against the perpetrators could be found. Due to the activity of law enforcement, Maria handed these documents over to her lawyer, who decided that they should be returned to the owner. Apparently, he found nothing important in the documents that could be used against her ex-husband. This robbery has not been solved to this day. Of course, most people knew whose work it was. The situation escalated further. After these events, Frank complained about the threats on social media that he regularly received from his ex-wife. In social media, she repeatedly expressed her displeasure with the way his new wife dealt with their children. The mother was very jealous of Julie, who spent a lot of time with their small children. Their internet disputes lasted until the winter of 2010. During this time, Frank seemed to lose patience again, and he turned to law enforcement. He reported the threats and presented the conversation with his ex-wife so that the investigators could assess Maria's behavior. The ex-wife claimed she didn't mean it badly and that it wasn't really threats, just a special way of communicating. The woman lost her composure during uncomfortable conversations with her ex-husband, so her words could not be interpreted as threats. Maria really wrote in a veiled manner, making it harder to prove her guilt, which logically had failed so far. Meanwhile, Frank and his new lover Julie were preparing for a romantic trip in January 2011. The couple wanted to visit the Caribbean. Unfortunately, Maria also learned of these plans. She began to write and called Julie to prove that her ex-husband did not love his new wife and that they still had a romantic relationship despite the divorce. Maria even arranged a meeting to which she lured Julie out and had a hateful conversation with her. Meanwhile, Julie tried to persuade Maria to leave the two alone, but it didn't work. From then on, things got even worse. One unfortunate evening, a fire broke out at Frank's house. His friends and neighbors learned about it. People immediately rushed to the house. They were sure that Frank had died in the fire. It seemed that the owner of the house was in the house and asleep, and his ex managed to commit the planned murder. Fortunately, Frank was not injured since he was not in the house at the time. As his friends and acquaintances stood in the driveway and watched the house burn down, Maria also drove up. She watched silently and smiling, then turned around and drove away wordlessly. That night, the house was actually empty. The only one in it was the dog of one of the children of the estranged couple, who unfortunately died in the fire. Frank turned to law enforcement again. He was convinced that the ex-wife had set the fire. In his opinion, the whole thing was no joke anymore but a serious threat to him and his family. Now the ex-wife had let actions follow words, and he had miraculously remained unharmed. But as with all other claims of the man, the police said there was no evidence because they had burned in the fire. The fire was documented as a result of a technical error. This fire case became another unsolved case involving Spencer. Surprisingly, Frank was unable to obtain trivial defense against harassment from the police officers, although there were obvious signs of Maria's involvement in these events. It seemed to him as if the police were in cahoots with the family. Finally, one of the police officers tried to pursue the alleged perpetrator and talk to him, as the fire chief had already prepared an official report about the accident. Unfortunately, an investigation was not possible. Nevertheless, the police officer was convinced that the arson could not have been an accident, especially against the background of the couple's long problematic relationship. Afterward, Maria sent Frank several text messages in which she mocked him. She accused him of having ruined her life and described what had happened as karma that he deserved. The stalker let the situation escalate further and sent several similar messages to Julie, claiming that she would be next. Of course, the police could not find anything reprehensible in these messages either. Since Maria remained unpunished, her arrogance only grew. She was no longer so anxious that she made several public threats against her ex-husband and his life partner. Apparently, she did not want to leave it at mere words. Only a few weeks later, a fire broke out in Julie's apartment. The worst thing was that she was at home at the time and had to jump from the roof of the porch to save herself. Fortunately, the woman remained unharmed, but her belongings burned, and she became homeless. Of course, she recognized from the similar handwriting that the incident was related to the fire at Frank's house. Julie's house did not burn down completely but was uninhabitable. Frank and Julie thought they could find some evidence in the ashes. In addition, the house was in a different district, so the desperate couple hoped for more interest from the police. But this time, too, the officers simply gave up. After a long conversation with the victims, the investigators said that there was no evidence and that the fire would be dismissed as an accident. Julie had to turn to a higher authority to force the police to investigate the incident, which advanced the case. Traces of flammable signal lamps, which could have been used for ignition, were found in her yard. One of the items was lying in the grass near the house, and it was also possible to find another of this kind, which apparently was the cause of the fire. The stairs to the house's terrace had been doused with gasoline. After careful consideration, the authorities finally admitted that the fire was due to arson. However, with that, the case was closed, and the culprit was never identified. Of course, both Frank and Julie immediately blamed Maria, who had been pursuing her ex-husband for a long time. Just before the incident, she had even threatened a fire. After the couple's relationship began, Maria began stalking her ex-husband under various pretexts. The threats became regular, and after her father was released from prison, this criminal couple seemed to spring into action. Despite the clear evidence of harassment, the police did not press charges for lack of evidence. The situation worsened further. In June 2012, Frank and Julie decided to separate for a while. In this way, they wanted to deceive Maria and give her a chance to calm down. To make it credible, they even wrote their story in the newspaper. This event coincided with the final divorce of the former spouses. The very next day, Frank was found dead. The family of the deceased immediately suspected the former wife of being involved in Frank's murder. The divorce of the couple had been finalized just one day before the murder, and new threats were allowed because Maria had not received the expected decision. From the beginning, the woman was against the divorce proceedings. The case was very controversial and protracted. The former spouses constantly clashed at every meeting. Indeed, Maria's bold and passionate temperament was initially the trait that attracted Frank. He himself had a very energetic character, which was reflected in Maria's temperament. Initially, they were inseparable and complemented each other perfectly, but over time, this roller coaster ride of the relationship became exhausting, and the relationship deteriorated. But could it have come so far that one of the parties brutally murdered the other? It was the task of the investigators to find out. When the police officers arrived at the house of the deceased, they saw large pools of blood and several extended traces as if someone had tried to remove the stains. The investigators found the first clues on the floor. A clear bloody shoe print was visible. A yellow rubber glove lay in the middle of the kitchen on the floor, and a second glove was found in the sink. When the gloves were examined for DNA traces, particles of Maria's skin were found in them. Friends of the victim claimed that she had not lived in the house for several years, which meant that the gloves could not have been left there by chance. All this indicated that the gloves had been used recently, suggesting involvement in the crime. The two suspects, Maria and her father, were arrested. In the whole town, it was said that the two were Frank's only enemies who could have wanted his death. Everyone knew about the years of harassment that Maria had staged to make her ex-husband's life hell. The arson was also blamed on Maria and her father by the neighborhood. Despite these convictions, the police needed solid evidence to bring them to court. After analysis in the forensic laboratory, these were quickly found. Frank had been shot with two different weapons. The first bullet, the forensic scientists believe, was fired from a rifle as the man stood near the front door. He probably went over to open it, and the attacker immediately began shooting. No gunpowder residues were found on the clothing, which means that the shot was fired from a considerable distance. The bullet went through the arm and hit the chest, severing a vital artery. This wound was fatal, but it was not the only one. The police suspect that the shot was fired from an appropriate distance. After the first wound, the victim was dragged into the house. Here, the attackers fired another pistol shot into the head at close range as they stood over Frank. The body showed clear traces of gunpowder gas. Obviously, the man had no signs of life at this point, so the second shot can be considered an act of revenge. The perpetrator clearly had a hatred for his victim. All this fit very well with Maria's image. If the first shot had not been fatal, the second would definitely have been fatal. The police believe that Rock had fired the rifle, and his daughter completed what he had started. The pair dragged the ex-husband into the house, threw him to the ground, and the woman shot him with the rifle. The investigators noticed that the dog and the car of the victim were missing. This gave the police new food for thought, and so the investigators decided to request recordings from traffic surveillance cameras. Soon after, the murdered man's pickup was spotted on a federal highway, presumably driven away from the house of F. This happened only a few minutes after Frank's death. Unfortunately, the recordings were too grainy to see who was behind the wheel of the vehicle. Finally, the pickup of the victim was found in the neighboring town of Sunbury, Pennsylvania, a place 40 kilometers from the victim's house and not far from the apartment where Maria lived. A short time later, the murdered man's dog was found by chance. It had been taken for his son to replace the dead animal that had not survived the first arson. Apparently, the animal was startled by gunshots and fled, but it was too far from Frank's house, which was suspicious. It was reported missing by the Spencer family, which was already quite notorious due to a sensational divorce process and harassment that everyone in the town knew about except the police. The investigators suspected that Maria wanted to pick up the dog to give it to her children later, but the animal escaped on the way while Rock was on the road in the stolen car. During the questioning of Rock, the investigators tried to find out where his shoe prints in the victim's house might have come from, but the man did not give up and told the ridiculous story that he had visited Frank the day before the murder. According to him, his daughter could not establish contact with her ex-husband, but he could get along well with him and had come by that day to help clean. Rock claimed that there were already large bloodstains on the floor of the house, which he had accidentally stepped into. Rock could not explain the blood in the house, and it was not possible to refute his statements about his friendship with the deceased. There were no witnesses who had seen conflicts with Rock, however, no one had seen that the two had been friends and interacted, so his version did not sound plausible. Moreover, the perpetrator claimed he had not stolen Frank's car, but that the deceased himself had given him the vehicle, which he supposedly wanted to buy. Rock claimed he had taken the vehicle the day before the man's death, when the deceased had come to help his former son-in-law. In this absurd way, the suspect clearly tried to justify why his fingerprints or DNA might have been found on any items at the crime scene. In fact, he immediately admitted to being present at the scene but tried to shift the timing back by 24 hours. The police needed more evidence, such as the murder weapon. However, it involved a hardened criminal who probably knew how to properly dispose of a firearm. During the search of his apartment, neither a rifle nor a pistol was found. Due to his parole, Rock was not allowed to carry a weapon. Maria did not own one either, but that did not change the fact that her father's criminal connections could have easily allowed him to obtain a weapon to kill his detested former son-in-law. Maria also refused to plead guilty to the murder. She claimed the gloves had accidentally come into her ex's house and denied any involvement in the case. Despite the ridiculous stories, the suspects were eventually released, but evidence against them continued to be collected. In the meantime, Maria went about her daily life calmly. One day, she attended her son's football game when a friend of Frank approached and tried to find out if the woman had something to do with the incident. However, she quickly saw through his intention and answered very evasively. According to her words, it seemed as though Maria had been at the crime scene and had seen her ex-husband's death, although she had not killed him herself. When the prosecutor dealt with the case, he was astonished at the indifference of the authorities towards Frank's numerous complaints against his ex-wife. All his demands were ignored, although death threats, even if veiled, represent a serious crime under the law, and the arson could be considered attempted murder. Despite the clear evidence, the investigators did not even try to thoroughly investigate the victim's claims, which puzzled the prosecution. For this reason, an internal investigation was initiated, during which the police received numerous complaints about the incompetence and negligence of the investigators. The investigators who ignored the complaints stated that they had not received any solid evidence of harassment, they had not heard any threatening voice messages, they said, nor had they been shown Frank's text correspondence. There was no way to prove negligent service, nothing was documented, and the only person who could confirm or deny the statements of the investigators was dead. The public and Frank's family were upset about this decision, but numerous complaints remained unanswered. The investigation stalled again because the investigators decided to prove not only stalking and murder but also numerous crimes committed before the man's murder. Finally, in 2013, a major interrogation was organized, and both suspects eventually agreed to speak with the police. Maria and Rock, however, pleaded not guilty to any of the 12 charges. This led to further charges of complicity, but the most important charge was the premeditated murder of Frank. The prosecution assumed that the criminals had traveled together to the crime scene. They used no public transportation to avoid attracting attention. After they had shot the defenseless victim, they fled in his car. During the investigation, the criminals were placed under house arrest, but by the end of 2014, Maria was finally taken to prison. Unfortunately, Rock had already fled by this time. Immediately after his testimony, he boarded a plane and flew to Colombia. The suspect landed in the vastness of South America. The prosecution considered this a flight attempt and clear proof of his guilt. The perpetrator could not be caught for 11 months until he was finally arrested. Rock had hidden near the U.S. Embassy in Buenos Aires, Argentina. He had been arrested by local police the previous week but resisted his extradition. This did not succeed, and he was sent back to his home country. In the fall of 2015, Maria stood trial for the murder of her ex-husband. She continued to deny involvement in the crime and blamed her father, who claimed she was only nearby. At the same time, numerous prosecution witnesses informed the court and the jury about the woman's long history of threats and arson. The trial lasted 9 days, after which the jury found the defendant guilty on all charges, including murder, arson, burglary, perjury, conspiracy, and threats. She was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 50 years. The criminal would thus never again enjoy freedom. Finally, in 2017, Rock also went to trial. Even fleeing to another country did not save him from justice, albeit much delayed. The man was clearly dissatisfied that his daughter had tried to shift all the responsibility onto him. According to the defendant, it was he who had helped her, but against the murder, it was Maria who wanted to get rid of her ex-husband. In the end, the ridiculous story of the criminal woman could not withstand the onslaught of the prosecution. Against the background of physical evidence, she looked pitiful. In the fall of 2018, Rock Franklin was found guilty of the murder of Frank Spencer. He was also found guilty of robbery and arson. Like his daughter, he received a life sentence without the possibility of parole, to which another 45 years were added. Custody of Maria and Frank's children was awarded to Maria's sister. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves.
Around 5:30 p.m. on January 2, 2020, an emergency call was received by the dispatch center. The victim was located 15 minutes from Bismarck, on the grounds of a farmhouse surrounded by cornfields. The caller's name was Nikki Enzel. She stated that she had been unable to reach her husband for several days and wanted to check on him. However, the woman could not enter the house because it was shrouded in smoke. Nikki could not see what was happening inside the house but believed that her husband Chad was there. She was visibly desperate, her speech interrupted by sobs, and her words were fragmented and unclear. Finally, the woman demanded that paramedics, firefighters, and police officers be sent to save her husband. When the special operations officers arrived at the scene, they found that the fire had spread from the guest room on the first floor, where the man was supposed to be. The fire was quickly extinguished and the burned body of a 42-year-old man was discovered on the bed in the bedroom. He was completely naked on the bed, and a shotgun was lying on the bed. The position of the shotgun was entirely unnatural. It was far from his hands, as if a third person had placed the weapon there. Chad could not have shot himself in this manner and then repositioned the weapon. However, the police officers quickly determined that the man had shot himself in the face. There were no burns on the skin, as are typical with self-inflicted gunshot wounds. The shot was fired from a great distance. The fire source could have been a gas heater, a rather dangerous heating source that often causes fires. However, it is an easy-to-use and cost-effective heating method widely used in the USA. Numerous cigarette butts were also scattered around the house, but it was suspicious that they did not appear to have been smoked. It looked like they had been lit and thrown around, which seemed quite odd. When the police went down to the basement, they found another likely source of the fire. There was an oven downstairs whose top was heavily burned. It could have overheated during operation and been another starting point for the fire. There were too many contradictions and inconsistencies in the overall picture, prompting the police to immediately work on multiple versions of the events, as suicide seemed unlikely. The whole scene looked more like an amateur staging. Chad Enzel was born and raised in North Dakota. Immediately after high school, he went to college, where he studied engineering, mechanical engineering, and drawing. After completing his education, he moved to Bismarck, where he took a job as an engineer at a local company. All acquaintances and friends described him as a very simple, family-oriented, kind, and friendly man. Besides his work as an engineer, he was a baseball coach for a children's baseball team. On weekends, he coached young athletes and also hosted sports events. In his free time, he liked to go bowling with friends. Chad was always calm and balanced, clearly not the type to get into trouble voluntarily. The man was naturally cheerful and never let himself get discouraged. He hardly seemed like a victim of a psychological disorder that would voluntarily end his life. On April 6, 2015, Chad officially announced on his social media page that he was in a relationship with a woman named Nikki Enzel. Chad was 3 years older. Acquaintances described him as very happy at that time. Just a year later, in 2016, they got married. The woman had 2 teenage sons from a previous relationship. She worked as a shipping clerk in a food company and was described by her husband's friends and family as very self-confident. Her social media profile was filled with selfies of herself, with only 2 pictures of her sons among them. She was also a rather difficult and challenging person, as many of her angry comments about the behavior of salespeople made clear. She obviously had no problem taking her anger out on other people and constantly got into conflicts with various individuals. Many people simply avoided communicating with this person. In addition to her job at the shipping company, she also had her own small business, dealing with catering events and parties, particularly baking sweets. The woman was very successful in this field, as she posted a large number of attractive works on her social media pages. From the outside, the couple seemed to have a very successful relationship. The man was an employee of a large company and held a managerial position, while Nikki worked in 2 jobs, including her own business. The couple raised 2 children, and everything went smoothly until that fateful night when the woman called emergency services. This case was strange from the beginning. If the couple really lived together and raised children, why was Nikki not at home for several days as well as her sons? This question interested the police, and they began to question the immediate neighborhood of the couple. The man's acquaintances and colleagues confirmed that they had not seen him for several days. That was strange, as the man was a department head and could not neglect his duties. Chad was very responsible, and it was untypical for him to miss work shifts. At the very least, he would have called the superiors to inform them if he could not come to work for some reason. So they were immediately concerned. It turned out that the deceased man was last seen on December 30th, 2019. He was spotted on the surveillance cameras of the local bowling club. The 42-year-old Chad was seen on the next day, but he did not show up at work. His wife Nikki called the organization and reported that the man was very sick and needed a few days to recover. January 1st was a holiday, but the man was supposed to come to work on January 2nd. However, as he failed to show up again, his colleagues decided to call him at home to make sure the chief engineer was okay. None of them were able to contact Chad. The company's employees felt compelled to call the police, asking them to check if the department head was okay. The police officers responded to the request and stood at the front door of the missing person on January 2nd, 2020, around 1:20 p.m. They knocked on the door, but no one opened it. The officers walked around for a while, looked into the windows, but found nothing suspicious. The house was quiet. They did not conduct a thorough check and did not open the door of the house as they were not authorized to do so. The police assumed that the man was just sleeping off the New Year's celebrations. The patrol officers called back and said that Chad was not home, but there was nothing else they could do to help. They then simply left. Subsequently, the company's employees, convinced that something was wrong, contacted the missing man's wife. The woman said she was at work but promised to check on her husband after her shift. By 5:30 p.m., she reported to the emergency center, explaining that she could not get into the house because of the fire and smoke. At the crime scene, especially in the room where the victim's body was found, the forensic experts found clear signs of arson. The mattress was burned, and the source of the fire could have been a gas heater placed near the mattress. Cigarette butts and empty whiskey bottles were scattered all over the floor. What interested the police the most was why the man's wife and children were not at home at the time of the tragedy, and why they had not seen each other for days. The investigators summoned the woman for questioning to learn more about the incident. Nikki was very depressed about her husband's death. She immediately complained that her husband always smoked in the house and suggested that this could have caused the fire. The woman lamented that she was not at home at the time and could not save Chad. However, her statement was not credible to the investigators, as they believed that the man's death was not an accident, but a staged murder, leading them to further question the woman. Nikki explained her absence from the house by saying that the heating had broken down, forcing her to temporarily move to a hotel as she could not stand the cold. However, the children were not with her or her husband. They were living with the woman's mother at that time because she was overwhelmed with work. When she recounted the incident, she suddenly burst out that she had to take the children away because Chad was an abusive drinker. Until that point, she had never mentioned her husband's anger and had only spoken well of him. After making this statement, she later revealed that she and her children were constantly victims of moral pressure and physical abuse by the man. The woman had a large number of photos showing bruises and injuries inflicted by her husband. She confessed to the police that she had moved the children and left herself because she was preparing to flee from the tyrant to Texas. She had already secured a job at the new location where she would soon be. The move was supposed to take place in a week, but her plans changed due to her husband's death. Now she had no reason to leave and no one to run from, so she decided to stay. At this point, the investigators had nothing against Nikki and let her go, but continued the investigation, considering her a suspect. The day after questioning the wife, the autopsy results came back. The forensic experts found severe facial deformities caused by a shotgun blast, and the entire front half of the body was burned. The victim was lying on his back when the fire broke out, so the entire back half of the body was less burned, and the forensic experts found soot marks there. It is, of course, impossible to shoot oneself in the back with a shotgun. In any case, there are much simpler ways to take one's own life. The cause of death was a gunshot wound, and Chad was already dead at the time of the fire, as there was no soot in his airways. The chief forensic expert determined that the man had been dead for quite a while, 2 or 3 days, meaning he could not have started the fire. It became clear that this was not an accident. Someone had shot the man and then started the fire. In this context, the widow naturally became the main suspect as she had a serious motive. Additionally, the investigators quickly discovered another possible motive that might have driven the woman to the crime: the attempt to get rid of Chad Enzel. It turned out that shortly after the incident, she contacted the insurance company to claim compensation for the property damage caused by the fire. The investigators also discovered the circumstances leading up to the tragic events. In December, the family received the house and insured it, and less than a week later, it burned down under unexplained circumstances. According to Nikki, the relationship with her husband was in a severe crisis. Could a loving wife solve 2 problems at once in this way? financial difficulties, and a husband who claimed equality with her. When the police investigated the crime scene, they found a package addressed to a man named Earl Howard. Naturally, this new figure in the case had to be checked. Quickly, his connection to Nikki was discovered. During their first questioning, she told the police that she had rented a hotel room, but upon checking, it turned out that the room was not registered to her, but to the man to whom the package was addressed. Earl Howard was an ordinary working man who spent all his free time at home. He originally came from Canada, but later moved to Bismarck, North Dakota, USA, due to an important job offer. 5 days after the fire, Nikki was brought in for questioning at the police station, where they began asking her leading questions about Earl. Initially, she denied knowing the man at all, but later unexpectedly admitted that she had a relationship with him. According to her, the two had an affair for a year, but her husband knew about it and accepted it. The woman continued to date her lover, as she had an open relationship with her husband. During this time, Chad started drinking more and getting drunk daily. Additionally, he frequently insulted his wife. During the questioning, the woman presented herself as a victim, crying constantly, yet continuing to tell her story, sometimes so quietly that the police had to ask her to speak louder. Experienced investigators believed that she was not sincere, but only trying to play the victim by shedding tears. She did not realize that the police had decided to play good cop and bad cop with her. In the initial phase of the interrogation, it was the good cop who stood by her side. When the bad cop came into play and pressured Nikki, she immediately changed her behavior and stopped crying. It was as if the woman realized that her tears would not have any effect, so she began to speak clearly and distinctly, without crying. After the investigator asked her to tell only the truth, the main suspect finally broke down and detailed the events leading to her husband's death on the night of December 30th. On the evening of December 30th, Chad visited his favorite bowling club, bowled for a few hours, and then went home. At this time, his wife was at the hotel with her lover. She planned to return home in the evening to pack her remaining belongings before leaving. However, when Nikki appeared at her front door, her husband was heavily intoxicated, began insulting her again, and physically attacked her. She said that in such moments she would just walk away. But at this point in the story, Nikki hesitated and began speculating on unrelated topics, complaining that her husband not only drank, but also lost money gambling. The bad cop had to pressure the suspect again to get her to answer the investigator's questions further. Unexpectedly, she confessed that she had not returned home alone that evening, but with her lover Earl. Her husband was visibly unhappy about this and started yelling at her, causing the woman to leave the house. According to the woman, Nikki heard a violent altercation and a scuffle between her lover and her husband, and then a shot was fired. However, she did not even ask Earl what had happened between the two when he left the house. Instead, the woman said they simply got into a car and drove off silently. The suspect wrote down her confession and placed it on the table. At that moment, she probably realized she might forget some details of the fabricated story, so she took the paper off the table and tried to tear it up. But the investigator was quick enough to snatch the confession from her hands. This behavior aroused even more suspicion. After the interrogation, the police officers had no doubt that the woman had something to do with Chad Enzel's death. The woman left the office in handcuffs. Later, while examining the crime scene, the investigators discovered a surveillance camera in the victim's home. This was a real stroke of luck for the investigators. The camera footage was seized and reviewed, revealing a lot of interesting things. The recordings show how Earl and Nikki arrived in front of the house on December 30th at around 10 p.m., about half an hour before Chad left the bowling alley. The woman and her lover went inside and stayed in the house for about 20 minutes. Then they came out with a stack of boxes, disproving the first part of the woman's confession. It turned out that she was already at the crime scene before her husband returned from the game. The investigators suspected that she had taken out belongings she wanted to save from the planned fire, which allowed her to at least be charged with premeditated arson. However, the entire picture had to be reconstructed, since such speculations were circumstantial evidence that might not be convincing to the jury. The couple then left the house, and Chad came home at 10:30 p.m., apparently not even realizing that his wife and her lover had been in his house. Shortly before 1 a.m., the car with Nikki and Earl pulled up in front of the house again. They entered the house, and then almost all the cameras went out. The only camera that still worked was the one filming the driveway. The view was limited and did not capture everything that was happening. Later, the couple left the house and drove away. The cigarettes found in the house were indeed the same ones the man had smoked, but they were not smoked to the end but set on fire and thrown onto the furniture and the floor where a fire could have started. This was obviously staged. Another incriminating factor was that Nikki was the sole beneficiary of the $26,000 insurance sum for the house. She was arrested on January 7th on charges of conspiracy to commit murder. After her arrest, bail was set at $500,000, but the woman did not have that much money, so she remained behind bars. It turned out that Nikki had already been convicted of fraud 3 times and was on probation at the time of her arrest. Investigators then went to Earl's house to arrest the accomplice of the criminal and get a statement from him. However, he was nowhere to be found as the man was on the run. Fortunately, the accomplice was not able to escape justice. 2 days after the woman's arrest, Earl was caught in Turin, Michigan. He was arrested at the border between this state and Canada, apparently trying to flee to his home country to escape U.S. jurisdiction. The man did not resist when he was arrested. After the arrest, the police were able to obtain further information from the suspect, enabling a more reliable reconstruction of the events of that fateful night. It turned out that the murderers had a much more important reason for the crime than the small insurance sum for the house. The accomplice's affair had lasted more than a year. During one of their meetings, the woman told her lover that the child had an insurance policy worth $600,000. They thought this money would solve their problems and give them the opportunity to live a carefree life. Nikki wanted to avoid all problems with the divorce and division of property, and therefore chose a darker and more profitable path for herself. They decided to kill the man and stage everything to look like a suicide. Next, the couple wanted to collect all possible funds from life and property insurance and flee to Texas forever. On December 9th, they made their decision and prepared the crime, which they carried out on the 30th. So that the children would not accidentally witness these events, Nikki sent them ahead to her mother. The woman knew her husband would go bowling that evening, so she came earlier and collected things she wanted to save from the fire. Video footage from the hotel showed the couple bringing the items to their room. Later that day, they returned to the crime scene. Nikki turned off the cameras and the security system. Earl had a shotgun with him. It remained unclear who exactly shot the victim, as the defendants tried to blame each other. What happened behind the closed doors of the house was impossible to find out. It was clear, however, that the murder happened while the man was sleeping. He was shot in the back and died instantly. Then he was turned over and shot in the face to stage a suicide. The perpetrators believed everything would go up in flames and the fire would destroy all traces, making their back shot impossible to detect by the forensic team. The weapon was carelessly thrown on the bed. Then the intruders poured out all the whiskey bottles they found in the house and threw them away to emphasize the man's drinking habits. They simply placed a gas oven in the room and set it on fire, expecting it to cause a fire, and left. The next day, they followed the news, hoping to hear something about the incident. But there was nothing. This only made them angrier, so they felt compelled to return to the house on January 2nd at 5 p.m. When the woman opened the door, the fire flared up immediately due to the draft. However, it was clear to her that the plan had not worked, as the house had not burned down to the ground as expected. Nikki called emergency services and realized it was impossible to eliminate all the evidence and traces she and her friend had left. She had to improvise to buy time to file insurance claims. During searches, investigators found fingerprints of both perpetrators as well as numerous DNA traces. The botched staging was immediately uncovered. Even the position of the shotgun on the bed revealed the attempt to mislead the investigation. If he had taken his own life, the shotgun could not have ended up in that position. This was one of the prosecution's arguments that convinced the jury. Nikki and Earl were charged with murder, At the last minute, the man agreed to a plea deal, allowing the prosecution to learn all the details of the crime. The 43-year-old Earl Howard pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit arson and tampering with evidence, and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 21 years. During the trial, the defendants tried to blame each other, but Earl was more inclined to accuse the victim's wife. He testified against her. Nikki, however, refused to plead guilty and claimed she was outside the house when the shot was fired and that Earl had shot him. She also claimed it was her lover who set the fire, threw cigarettes, and staged a suicide. Earl was supposed to testify as a witness, but that did not happen. Later, Nikki was interrogated again. The woman told absurd stories that her husband knew about her affair and allowed them to meet, and that Earl and Chad were friends. Nikki claimed her husband was an alcoholic. However, no one in the family circle believed that the man drank heavily, beat his wife, and allowed her to go out with a lover. The husband was a department head with great responsibility, worked with children, and never gave any reason to doubt his qualities. He was never seen drunk and valued his family and work. Therefore, no one believed the defendant's story about a bad husband. Everyone thought she was making it up. Each successive story differed from the previous one. Nonetheless, the 41-year-old Nikki was found guilty on February 17, 2023, of conspiracy to commit murder, arson, and attempted cover-up of the crime. On March 16, 2023, she was sentenced to life imprisonment with parole after 36 years, plus 15 years for arson. This verdict was controversial because the sentence for the victim's wife was significantly harsher than for the lover. At the same time, there was every reason to believe that he was no less involved in the crime. However, this was justified by the fact that the lover admitted his guilt and cooperated with the investigation, while Nikki did not. The court's decision was not reviewed, meaning the first appeal of the criminal can be filed in 2026. Thanks for watching, and take care of yourselves.